Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Marielza Oliveira of UNESCO. Marielza, welcome to the program.
Wow, welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to having this conversation.
Let me briefly introduce you to the audience, to the listeners. You are currently the director of the Division for Digital Inclusion Policies and Information with UNESCO in Paris. Before that, director of UNESCO in Beijing. Before that, another UN agency, UNDP. You also have a background with, you can say, the US Army Construction Engineering Research. You have an AI background, Master of Science in Finance, and a Ph.D. in Business Administration. So a lot of, you could say, great baggage of knowledge and experience. And you are a native from Brazil, correct?
Correct, indeed.
Hey, let me and by the way, given your current responsibility, UNESCO, the common theme for our discussion is going to be information as a public good.
Fantastic.
Before we're going to have that conversation, I just wanted to know, how does one become an employee of UNESCO or of a UN agency? How did your journey start?
Oh my God, I will have to say that I literally was kidnapped by aliens, like when I joined the UN. It wasn't something that I expected to do. I started, getting my master's in finance and PhD in business, thinking that I would go back to Brazil and work as a consultant. And in fact, that's exactly what I did as soon as I finished my degrees. And at that time, I had actually a neighbor that worked for the UN in Brazil, and came to me and said, I'd like to do a fundraising project, because I have this important project, and I would like to have a strategy for that. Can you indicate some of your colleagues to do some consulting for me? And I told them, like, I'm sorry to say, my colleagues charge about 5 times what the maximum you're able to pay. And that's my junior people, so I can't, indicate anybody, but I can do pro bono for you. I'll be happy to do something. You're a friend. And so I did this project, literally on a weekend for him.
Okay.
And a few months later, I get a phone call, with this guy saying, I'm the res rep of UNDP in Brazil, and I would like to, to tell you that we have some vacancies and would like to apply. And in my mind, I never heard that term res rep before, because it means resident representative of a United Nations entity, so it's the maximum title. It was the boss,
Okay.
but in my mind, I thought sales rep. And I just said, thank you very much, and hang up on the guy, like, I'm not interested, and hang up. And then, my friend called, and oh my God, are you crazy? This is the lead of the UN in Brazil. He talks to the president, to ministers. I wanted him to, he called you personally. And I was like, oh my God. So what do I do to clean up your area for you? And call him back and apologize. And, and that I did. And then we talked, and I sent my CV. And in the end, I ended up interviewing with the UN. And at the time, I wasn't thinking of joining the UN at all. I was happy where I was, so, I told them, I'm not the right person for you. I am really not the right person in my interview process, and, I would have changed everything about government and supporting governments and etc. And about a month later, I get a job offer from them. And I called back and I said, I told you I'm not the right person. And they told me back, and they said, you're wrong. You are the exact person we need, because we exactly thinking out of the box and, looking at things from a different perspective. And we have a lot of different financial processes coming up that we would like to support governments with, so that they can do better taxes, they can do better oversight of capital markets and things. So you do have the profile. So come over. And I said, okay, I'll stay for 2 years. And kidnapped by aliens, I'm here 22 years later, loving every minute of it and never thinking of going back.
Okay, so well, first of all, that was a very productive weekend. Don't know what was in your report and your advice to your next door neighbor, but it paid off, I would say.
Oh my God, yes. As a matter of fact, it did. Not in financial terms. Let's put it this way: the private sector always, pays, a lot more, but in satisfaction, in really real satisfaction in making a contribution. In changing things.
Yeah.
My background, it starts in economics. I'm a bachelor's in economics, and you learn about these issues of the value for money, the issues of making sure that you look at the economic side of things. But really, the fact is that when you love what you do, when you really find the place where you say, this is where I'm meant to be, this is what I'm meant to do, this is how I can best contribute. It's really not something about, it's not about, making money. It's about, making a life that is worth living.
Making a difference, contributing, being relevant. That's what I hear you say.
Exactly, and I found my niche, so I was incredibly happy and grateful, for the
Okay.
opportunity that I would never have sought myself.
Okay, now we have quite a number of, say, younger listeners. Could you make a statement? This is a conclusion you can draw in hindsight. It's not about the money, it's about the fulfillment. Or can you remember that was also your mindset those 22 years ago?
It was very much my mindset at the time, and I think that people should, if I were to give advice, to myself, 22 years ago, or to people who are in the same place right now, I would say, don't look at so much at how much, the profession or the role or whatever will pay you.
Mhm.
Think of the value that you want to create in this world. And the world will recompense you for creating that value. Sometimes it will recompense you monetarily. Sometimes it will recompense you with the kind of, of a satisfaction, of a tranquility of soul, that you rest and say, at the end of the day and think, really, that was a fantastic day. And, if you really wake up on a Monday and you dread your week, you should be looking for a different place to be. If you look at Mondays and go like, yay, it's Monday, wow, here you go,
Or
that,
even better, why wait till Monday and do it on
oh,
Sunday?
why wait till Monday? But if you're really, waking up and thinking, yes, today is a good day, like I'm geared up to go, and that's the kind of life you want.
I recognize that. I recognize that with a large number of people we speak for the brand called you. Although I also have to point out, I mean, you have invested quite a lot in yourself to get there. In a sense, executive education, Master of Science in Finance, a PhD. So you had to put in a lot of sweat and hard effort and work to get there, probably. Otherwise, your neighbor would not recognize you as somebody who could help him.
Well, that's true. You have to seek out the knowledge that will help you to think through and really organize your approach in a way that is productive. And people think, but a business degree at the UN, a capital markets finance at the UN, that's exactly what makes me very different from other UN staff. They usually tend to be, international relations people, development, economic development or social development staff, and etc. But I have this unique set of skills. And the thing of having a unique set of skills, you need to invest in them so that they really, shine, but you also need to find, how do you apply that kind of skill set to where you are, because this kind of skill set can be applied anywhere in the private sector, in civil society, in government, and and I actually did it. I worked in all these different sectors, and in each and every one of them, I found exactly the kind of thing that says, yes, this skill set is incredibly tailored for this, but it's because you need to deeply know what you're talking about, so that you can really find that kernel of value, of gold, right there to apply it.
Great. Now you're applying all that knowledge and experience for UNESCO. Now, most people would associate UNESCO with the World Heritage sites. I mean, fully acceptable. That's where it's famous for. But you are the direction of the division, Digital Inclusion Policies and Information. What does that side of UNESCO do? And how do we as society become aware of what UNESCO is trying to aim for?
Well, the kind of the blurb that we talk to partners about is to say this is the area that looks at defending human rights in the digital era. Freedom of expression, access to information, digital transformation, privacy. Those are things that have been changing so much because we live online as much as we live offline. Think about how you contact your friends, how you work with them. The fact that we are having a meeting on Zoom right now, and
Yeah.
thousands of people will be looking at it and participating in this kind of conversation, that you work online, you learn online, it's so yeah, I mean, but those things give us incredible opportunities. You can engage with anybody anywhere, but also gives an incredible risk. Your data ends up in places you don't know, and you end up being explored, and exploited. That personal information about you gets exploited. That you're surveyed against your will. You end up exposed to cyber crime and cyberbullying and hate speech and misinformation and those things. So somebody has to be looking at, how do we address those risks? How do we make the best out of our digital environment? And this is what our team does.
Okay, that is quite a steep challenge given the fact that we have a global, I would say, digital transition taking place. So
Yeah.
there is, I mean, each and every citizen organization is touched by the digital transition. So, how big? I mean, this seems like you need thousands and 10,000s of people to think about, okay, how are we going to organize governance? How are we going to keep it safe?
Well, it does. It needs, all of us, as a matter of fact, but it needs us to, at UNESCO CI sector, the communications and information sector, what our team does is engage networks and give them the tools so that they can go ahead and support in their own local circumstances these processes to happen. So, for example, we have, you talk about the digital transition, we call it digital transformation. This is an incredibly important topic. You're learning online, you have your health, just access to justice online, your payment schedules online, everything. So who thinks through these processes? Usually this is done by, like a Ministry of Education or a Ministry of Finance, or, and who helps them think through these processes? So what kind of guidance do they have? Just an example, we have last year we launched a training for judges, for what we call judicial actors, judges, Supreme Court judges, and judges from high courts, public prosecutors, and so on, to explain to them all the concepts behind artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and the rule of law. because they actually have to decide on cases, to make decisions, to make judgments on cases that have to do with artificial intelligence. Because if somebody gets sued because their data was scraped or, and so on. But also, they actually want to use artificial intelligence to improve the way justice is delivered in their environments. But they don't know, they're not trained on that. They're legal experts. So, how do they what can be done to help them understand how the legal concepts and the technological concepts come together, so to show us opportunities and risks, and how do they, what are the peer networks that they can tap in to learn from each other. So that's the thing we formed, for example, and it was incredibly effective. We trained 4,500 judges on the first cohort, 140 countries, and they now are talking to each other and learning, because they are in the process of doing exactly that. So whenever they have, like a question, who do they ask to? They go into the network and say, have you guys seen this happen before? How do you deal with that in your own jurisdiction, and so on? So that helps create this movement. And that's the kind of thing that we do.
Okay, so it's what I hear you say, it's not leading the movement, but facilitating the movement, guiding the movement to make it happen.
Exactly, because, it's the co-creation process that is really the meaningful one. We're not knowledgeable about everything.
Yeah.
And our team is small, as compared to the 8 billion people in the world that actually have to, to benefit from this, from what we do. So the idea is to actually say, let's empower you. Your institution, your government, your civil society organization, yourself as an individual and a professional, so that you can contribute to this process from your expertise, because everybody's an expert on something, and have learned how to do it, and can come from that knowledge base to help society.
What I think of when you describe your work, begs me I was thinking about, how do you define then success? How do you at the end of the day judge, okay, now we've done something worthwhile, meaningful? How does it look like?
It looks like, what it looks like is when there's the anecdotal part, and then there's the statistical part. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
The statistical part, let me give you an example. About a few years ago, we had about 60 countries only that had information laws, meaning that they had legal frameworks, laws that protect and enable people's rights to request information from their governments. It's the FOIA, in the US, for example, the Freedom of Information Act, that people can actually ask the government and receive that kind of information. Now we have 140 some, countries having that. Yeah. So you see the statistical progress of the in terms of number of countries that actually adopted and enacted law that enables their citizens to really question their governments. And that's an essential part of democracy, an essential part of citizen control, and so on. And so that's the kind of thing. But then there's also the kind of anecdotal side, which speaks to our heart. Sometimes somebody writes to you and say, really, I never knew this, but then using the laws that exist in my country now, thanks to the work that you guys done, we were able to obtain this kind of information and solve an issue that was about us. So that is this fantastic. It is really fantastic. Or when a judge comes to you and say, wow, really, I'm using the knowledge that you gave me, and this is the kind of case that I used it on, and that case affects 800,000 people in my country. And you go, wow, this is fantastic.
So I now see the whole value of storytelling of that anecdotal approach, providing inspiration. I was just wondering, where do you draw your inspiration from yourself?
Well, I'm a nerd. I mean, I love statistics. You know, statistics to me, and that's, I'm a data scientist kind of thing. I love numbers. But I'm very aware that the word number starts with num. I know, and and that when you start spouting statistics, and people don't want to know that. They want to know what exactly it tells you about about this situation itself, and what can you tell them about, how do you personalize that? So I draw inspiration, as a matter of fact, as a nerd, from the statistics, but I'm very aware that behind each number, behind each average, behind each percentage, each total, there is actual, there are millions of human beings whose lives are really, affected by it. So when you say, the poverty rate has reduced, to now it's whatever, 5%, and you look at that number, 5% of the global population is a huge percent. It's a huge number of people, and their deprivation it goes into various degrees. So you really want to understand. You need to have the empathy to put yourself in their shoes, and see what deprivation will really create in your life, so that you can actually think of how to act, and not only the empathy and put themselves in your shoes, but you want to talk to them to understand their experience really concretely, so that you can actually support the improvements that need to happen. So I love the statistics. I'm a nerd. What can I say?
Okay, fully accepted. And I recognize this, to be honest, a bit. Now, how you describe what you're doing with UNESCO with so much passion, you could say that almost assumes UNESCO, or as a UN agency, is quite a dynamic organization where you can make a difference and impact on a global level. At the same time, I happen to know your predecessor, more or less, the late Dr. Indrit Banerjee, who unfortunately passed away, that he realized he was making an impact, but sometimes he was also quite frustrated with how what the pace of change was. So how does UNESCO, how do you personally deal with the fact that the digital transition we just talked about, which needs that governance to make sure that it becomes it remains public good? How do you balance that with sometimes the bureaucratic engine which a UN agency is?
Well, you put your finger on the on a very painful, part of the work. Bureaucracy is the mind killer indeed. But I understand the need for bureaucracy. I understand, the UN is one of the most important entities in the world, but it has nothing. It has no assets in a way. All it has is reputation. It's companies, they have funds, they have capital assets, they have things. The UN has reputation. Most of our buildings, except for the very iconic ones, are actually rented out, and so on. So we have people, and we have reputation, and reputation requires quite a lot of, but protection. And of course, the protection goes into the different types of scrutiny and analysis that bureaucracy gives. So I understand that. I accept that. That's the price we pay for the privilege of working for the UN, and I think that's nowhere in the UN system or in UNESCO, perhaps, you see the big contrast so much, because we work on digital, which is the fastest changing, most fast pacing kind of environment and technologies that you can find. But the kind of work we do, also has to understand the different context around the world. So many times we think of digital as the state of the art, the new chat bot that is coming out and of large language models to be able to do this and that. But the reality is that where digital transformation is most needed is where in countries where you don't have necessarily electricity yet, in all areas, and remote parts of poorer countries that have not yet benefited from the ability to draw, a socioeconomic value from digital transformation. And so, the kinds of things that sometimes you need to do, and their pace is slow. Sometimes we are actually way ahead, or, you think of bureaucracy of the UN, but oh my God, we're actually moving faster,
Okay.
in comparison to this.
It's actually interesting. You explained why it is as it is, and to what extent would it help also just by explaining why we have that speed? You take away part of the frustration, and people can understand. Look, this is the reason why it takes so long, because we want everybody to catch up.
Absolutely. You need the consensus.
Yeah.
The UN is a club of
Yeah.
nations. It's
Yeah.
the United Nations.
Yeah.
And you need the consensus. And 193 member states of UNESCO arriving at consensus is a miracle. It's
Yeah.
global governance is a miracle of goodwill. And every day that I watch it happen, it's like, wow, so fantastic.
Yes. Hey, Marielza, it's fascinating here you talk about your work at UNESCO and what you're trying to achieve. Couple of last questions in the dying moments of this discussion. First of all, what can a listener do to educate him or herself on what UNESCO is doing? Is just surfing to the website, or are there other things people can do?
Oh, please, first of all, first surf to the website and access the documents we have. Plenty of guidance, plenty of news, plenty of different types of publications that tell you a bit of what we are about, what are the challenges that we are facing right now, but also participate in our events. We're always, inviting people to participate in major, important conversations around the world. And just one of those coming up in February, for example, pretty soon, we'll have a conference called Internet for Trust.
Okay.
And where we are going to be talking about how do we regulate internet platforms so that information becomes truly a public good, that we eliminate or mitigate some of the harms that exist, hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, but at the same time preserve freedom of expression and access to information. So that's not about removing content, but removing, creating the rules that enable expression to happen without the harms, happening as well. So, participating in this kind of event, sending your inputs, contributing, engaging is the best way, and we hope to see everybody doing it.
Yeah. Good advice. I'll make certain that we include a link to the summit you mentioned, the Internet of Trust, so people can have a look. And if they see it, listen to this afterwards, then look at the proceedings. Last question. You started at the beginning a little bit to explain your views on that, but again, I want to come back. What is your advice to young people starting their own journey? What would you want to give them?
Oh my God, I would say that, young people, let me think about my daughters, because they're, well, not that young anymore, but still, when I look at them, what I want them is to find a place where they can really be happy and productive, happy, satisfied member of society. So the advice that I give them is prepare yourself, understand what the challenges that the world has, but then look at your community, look around you and say, where can I make a difference in my own community? Because it starts there. And from there you grow, your own, possibilities of helping you. You find like-minded people and you create networks, and that's the power of connection. So connect to other people, exploit and explore and enhance that connection capability. And that's, you will be making a difference wherever you are, if you are able to do that.
Marielza, I want to thank you again for the interview. Very strong and solid advice to end this conversation with. Thank you, and hope we'll meet again.
Thank you, so much for having me, and hope to meet you again many times. See you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.